If the Terminator could come back in time, couldn't they bring weapons if they just wrapped them in human flesh? Why is it that the Joker wanted to kill Batman? Things we watch, things that watch us, things we hear, things that are listening, the make-believe, the real, and where they intersect. Join me as I offer zero answers, give no advice, and really not much more than maybe a little bit of entertainment. Please, or my mom will call you. Grab a seat. This is the screening of life. And what the hell did happen to the Brady's dog? I have always found some level of comfort in being made uncomfortable. Paradoxical, I know, but it's a fundamental truth about my being that I have made peace with, for the most part. Over the course of my life, this quirk has taken on many shapes, some ultimately constructive, and others not so much. My willingness to engage in cinematic fear is one of those indelible traits that I cannot imagine my life without. As a child, I was raised on Universal Studios monster movies. One of the many credits to my boyhood is that I was allowed to watch a lot of the movies that my parents themselves absorbed as children. Showing me such greats as Dracula, the Wolfman, the Creature from the Black Lagoon, and the like was a pure joy. The fact that I was well versed in the legacy of Bela Lugosi and that Vincent Price was a household name is something that I take great pride in. I was a horror kid, right from the very beginning. Those movies were perfectly suited for the boy who saw them. They provided just enough glimpse into the dark to whet the appetite of someone that would eventually enjoy a lifelong love of scary movies. At the time, it was hard to imagine of anything having come before them. What with their clearly antique look, their crackling sound, to the young boy who saw them, they seemed the inception of scary movies. That there was another Dracula before Bela Lugosi told Jonathan Harker that he never drinks wine. That a Frankenstein predated the iconic lurching of Boris Karloff, these seemed impossibilities. There is a creeping certainty that comes with the decision to watch a silent horror movie. This is that no matter what, you're going to be made uncomfortable. I believe that this is a genuine reaction that is, even now, the intent of early filmmakers who were working brilliantly within their limitations of the era. That, for a lot of these movies, the bottom line is that they are both hard to watch and hard to look away from. I had a conversation with my friend Micheal Sweeney, a singer, songwriter, and lifelong fan of most things that go bump in the night. Sweeney is the type of guy who invites you to a viewing of movies from the 1920s at a local church for $5. The type of thing that you initially bemoan, but then end up having a blast. If you do not have a friend like Sweeney, I'd suggest you find one.
We grew up, or at least I grew up in an era when you didn't have access to every film that you ever wanted to see. And silent movies in particular, a lot of them, you might have seen images that had entered like the popular conscious, of Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin and stuff like that. As kids, we would see that stuff, but if you ever got to see them on TV in any capacity, they were at the wrong speed with wonky music, you know what I mean, that was probably slapped on last minute by a studio trying to get the thing out, and then you wouldn't have anything close to what the experience of those movies actually was. So they started to form a kind of mystique, And as a kid who grew up reading things like Famous Monsters of Filmland and Starlog magazine and things like that, images of Lon Chaney Sr. as the Phantom or as the vampire in London After Midnight, things like that, it became a very like mysterious and culty kind of thing, and the purest understanding of what cult movies are. It's like the more esoteric and weirder and out there they were, the more I'd be drawn to them. You know what I mean?
The precursors to almost everything, utilizing vaudevillian aspects of performance and more serious stage and theater performance, while also inventing film composition techniques that would become standard. These artists were able to produce a level of atmospheric haunt that some would say has not been recreated since. Or, more accurately, that when it is recreated, it is very intentionally meant to be echoing the movies that sprung from this era. Silent films in general occupy a particular space in the overall zeitgeist of the cinephile. In some circles, it's considered entirely reasonable to write off this era as being hard to watch and even boring. A simplistic view that I do not share, however one that can be forgiven. These movies are different. I have always been a fan of looking deeper, especially with the things that I enjoy. I am grateful that I have friends that are willing to do the same.
The silent era was such a young period in the history of movies that I almost think of it, and I'm going to say something wonky here, but I almost think of it as being kind of like how I see a baby will be connected to the life beyond this one, because it's maybe come from there a little bit, more recently than the rest of us hasn't gotten older and more jaded and lost a lot of that magical, wonder that you approach the world with when you're a kid. And so all of these silent movies are very much, I think, like close to that, like almost like archetypal dreamlike kind of sense, where they're like trying all sorts of techniques because it was such a new medium that no one was telling them you can't do that. You know what I mean? So they're doing all these visual things with the camera where it's pure dreamlike storytelling where you don't have words to fall back on.
There is a rare instance in movie going that I have had the pleasure of experiencing every now and then. I could sum this up in one word: efficiency. When a movie has to do very little explanation and is capable of simply showcasing the story and emotion through their visual representation, the actors, the sets, the composition all come together to guide us where dialogue might only serve to distract from what's on screen. The most modern example I can think of is the 2013 Shane Carruth film Upstream Color, which contains almost no expository dialogue and not a single word wasted. Everything spoken is utilized to its utmost. Another more classic example would be John Carpenter's Halloween, in which the latter half of the movie is essentially a silent horror film. This shortcut to the emotional beats is something that silent films needed to excel at. So in a way, we are granted through them a continually shorter route from the A to B of a great scary movie.
It's like I'm always chasing that dragon of re-experiencing my first time watching a movie where I was shocked and surprised and delighted, particularly when you're seeing it with an audience and you're all having that communal gasp at like all the rawness of it and stuff, and so I feel like silent movies, there's nothing that gets in the way of that. It's just a pure emotional experience that you have to engage in. You know what I mean? Because you don't have somebody telling you what to think. The scores hopefully are good ones, but they're largely probably not the ones that would have been played with the original film, because it's a totally different style and milieu now, in terms of silent scoring, than what people actually would have heard when they went and saw these things in the first place. So that's it. It's a pure mainline form of emotion, I think, that I really appreciate, and it gets me back to something that I think movies should be. I think that art should be, and I always was struck by something that Buster Keaton said about how like he made it a point of pride to have maybe like one or two intertitle cards in his movies where everybody else would have like 15 and 17. He's like, I don't need all that. It's like if I'm not telling the story without those, then I'm not doing my job. You know what I mean? So I think there's something super immediate about him that kind of mainlines into like who we are as people. And I think that's what I love about it.
While I had maintained mastery of all things horror as a child, I did not delve into the world of silent horror movies until I was a young adult. I first saw Nosferatu, the full title of which is Nosferatu, a Symphony of Horror, and boy does it live up to that title. I first saw this out of obligation when I was 17 years old. My mother had gotten me a book entitled The Encyclopedia of Monsters. Being an avid vampire fan, I turned right to the entry on Dracula, only to find that there was none. In the introduction, the book contained a footnote in which it stated that Dracula was actually in their companion book, The Encyclopedia of Villains. Feeling dejected and not being able to make sense of this, what I perceived to be glaring error, I turned to the entry on vampires, which led me to Nosferatu. After seeing the spidery, veiny visage of Max Schreck portraying Count Orlok, I knew I must seek this movie out. Surprisingly hard to find in 1997, a time of only limited access, where my options for films to digest was restricted to what one could find at the local Blockbuster Video. Luckily, I had many partners in crime, all of whom shared my passion for these types of experiences. One of them had a copy of Nosferatu, and we watched it on a Tuesday afternoon after school, in my living room with the curtains drawn. The fact that the sun was indeed up at the time of our viewing did not seem to matter. The moment the sepia-toned text comes on screen, an unanticipated shiver went up my back. This was one of those moments, the kind you can only identify in hindsight, in which you are about to be changed.
I would see a lot of these titles and like, some other public domain titles and things like that didn't get like, that had already had their primetime runs. And so they were now like on the Saturday afternoon movies, like the Vincent Price Vibes movies and the Roger Corman Poe cycle and stuff like that. And, a lot of the AIP B movies that have since become hard to find would play with these. Like I was Teenage Frankenstein and I was Teenage Werewolf and stuff like that. So I didn't really differentiate between these older movies and these. They were all in the same place for me. My brother and I would sit down with a jug of ice cream and watch horror movies on Saturday afternoons. And the ones that would stand out and the ones that would stay with me were the ones that did establish like that iconography or that central image that you couldn't get away with. I mean, so The Phantom, again, when I first saw that in the context of the movie, and I think I saw that one actually, it must have been on PBS, not UHF. But that one and that big reveal, where the mask comes off, it was such seeing it in context. And I'd seen it before in clips and, his face in Famous Monsters on the cover of one of my Famous Monsters magazines when I was little. But seeing it in context and understanding that this is his character that you have gotten to know now, you don't know much about him other than like, he's probably been wronged somehow,
As my upbringing progressed and my consumption of fiction modified in both quantity and quality, waxing and waning depending on my adolescent disposition, I kept my experience with Nosferatu in my back pocket. It would be a long time before I sat myself in front of another silent movie. This was an odd departure for me. I was the type of kid that sought out every piece of information that he could about the things he enjoyed. And while there was certainly something different about this experience, there was no doubt that I enjoyed it. It would be some time before I could pinpoint exactly what it was that I was avoiding about these types of movies. When I finally did, it was in the express interest of attempting to expand my horizons. In my early 20s, I worked for a popular DVD store in West Los Angeles. My tenure as an employee was, shall we say, short-lived. This was the case with most of my employment at the time, and is really all you need to know about my work ethic in my 20s. Before setting that bridge gloriously ablaze, though, I took full advantage of having such a treasure trove of titles at my disposal. I can recall taking home boatload of movie after movie every weekend. One such weekend, I saw fit to bring home Metropolis, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, The Phantom of the Opera, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and once again, Nosferatu. I recall quite fondly that over a long weekend, I spent one day watching all these movies by myself, and then the next day watching them with several friends. I'm grateful for both experiences. There is something about that shared moment, several people watching a movie together that you have already seen. I find this to be doubly true when the movie in question is a horror movie. For me, I believe that it helps me to feel a bit safer, that somehow even the previous viewing, for which my partner was not present, has been diluted a bit. I tend to feel as though I'm watching the movie on much different terms than if I am watching it alone. No different than the feeling that everything will be okay so long as we make it until sunrise.
I literally negotiate in my mind the days and ages at which I can start subjecting my daughter to all of these, you know what I mean? So she's 9 now, and she's seen Jaws. I covered her eyes for a couple of things, but I was like, no, if you're going to understand your father, you need to see Jaws. You know? So she's seen that, you know, and other things I've shown her, like they're very familiar with Universal monsters, because those are, again, more dreamlike and kid friendly. Like most kids like the Frankenstein monster, you know what I mean?
An attempt by a father to share the experience he had with his children. Not in a selfish way, although an enjoyment of passing it on would indeed take place, but in a means of allowing them to grow as he did. I have a similar ticking clock in my head with my own children, a list of experiences that I've had with fiction that I cannot wait to transmit to my sons. I believe there is a simple principle at work there. A realization that you cannot shield your kids from the scary things in the world. Fear is real. It will be a part of your life. It was after that long weekend that I discovered what it was about these films that had delegated them to my ignore pile for years upon years. Quite simply, they scared me rather profoundly. They scared me, and I wanted to avoid them.
So I think it's that sensibility, I think, that comes from the play of light and dark. You know, it's natural to the medium where you're using black and white film, and you're creating on the fly, and you're trying to create a world that represents a psychology like Caligari does, or Nosferatu does, even though Nosferatu is using a lot of actual locations, you know. But it's how you're playing with light in that dreamlike way that makes all the difference. There's no mistaking, you know, one of these films for anything other than what it is. It's a horror film, you know what I mean? And you know the tone right from the get-go. And I think that's it, you know. There's something to do with the tone that encompasses all of these things. And if I could pin it down to one thing, I don't think I can. But I think it's the tropes that they were making up on the fly as they went, you know, that kind of came from all this exploration of light and shadow. And that's really what it is. And that's the very elemental thing. It's what you can't see in the dark is something to be afraid of, and that's something we all grow up with.
There is quite a simple scene in Nosferatu, in which the protagonist, John, is dining with his host, Orlok, in his Transylvanian castle. Everything is calm, and the music takes a more playful and less creepy tone. The conversation is stilted but present. John is cutting through a loaf of bread when the clock chimes and distracts him. Without realizing it, he cuts through the bread and into his thumb. I can actually recall jumping upon the realization of John's predicament. They had managed to transmit, through no dialogue, the tension and fear that John was feeling in that situation. And on top of that, the fear that we are feeling, knowing more than that character knows about where he is and what his host's motivations are. Count Orlok, his eyes wide at the sight, rises and approaches. You can see the undead monster's eyeballs pulsing with delight at the surprise that has arrived before him. Through the screen, you can feel him coming. The knots that began to tighten in my stomach, even as I'm describing this scene now, are a treat for me still. Now, there are a lot of very good horror movies being made. I'd readily point to Train to Busan as the most brilliant zombie movie I've seen in years, and REC before that. It Comes at Night is a shining example of psychological terror, while modern classics like Cabin in the Woods manage to celebrate and mock the genre all at the same time. Even the fan-made Call of Cthulhu, which is a 2005 H.P. Lovecraft adaptation done as a silent movie, manages to capture the overall aesthetic and atmosphere inherent to its actual silent predecessors. However, there is something about a film being made when there are no other means available, and it's still being able to produce that visceral, primitive effect in the viewer. An effect that so few of the current incarnations of horror are capable of mimicking. In a world that now includes torture porn, found footage movies galore, and reboot after reimagining after, well, whatever the most recent Halloween movie was. We are lucky to have access to such an innate part of cinema history. Not only for what it foreshadowed as far as the medium goes, but for what I can see about myself in these movies. Or, more specifically, in my reaction to these movies.
It has to have a certain kind of specificity to it so that it creates a real organic feeling where you're listening to somebody and you think, okay, this person has actually experienced this thing. But it also can't be so specific that it can't apply to a million different, people having a million different experiences. What did Johnny Cash say about how like songs are about God, death, or love, and that's pretty much it? You know what I mean? It's kind of that. It's like those immediate things, and there's a spectrum there. Things fall in between the cracks, but I think that's kind of true. You're just looking for the most immediate emotional truth that you can relate, and it's got to be through an experience of yours, but it can't be so specific to you that nobody else gets it.
To me, this evocation is one of absolute, soul-churning disturbance. I am watching reflections of my own mortality in stark black and white, monsters in the dark coming into the light against the symphonic score. The conflux of paradoxical elements alone is enough for me to fully recognize the discomfort. I believe that this is the reaction that most have, that this is the discomfort, that this is the thing that we want to look away from, but also feel as though we cannot. Fear, in its most simplistic form. The light and the dark, waging war with each other right in front of my eyes.
But it's also all atmosphere. I mean, you have to establish an atmosphere in those movies, and you have to do it quickly. And the imagery has got to be like kabloom. You know what I mean? Like it's got to be right there the second the shot comes up.
A friend of mine once told me that courage does not exist in the present moment. There is only fear and forward movement. That courage exists only as a notion of reflection. I can look back on a moment that I've moved through and grown from and take stock of the courage that it took to do so. With each of these experiences, I can look back and find even the slightest amount of courage in something as simple as watching a movie that I know will scare me. There is something at work there, whether I realize it or not. I am afraid in my life all the time. That's okay. I know that it might make it sound as though I exist as a taut rubber band, but that is not the case. I do not believe that the absence of fear is a human possibility. Fear is how I know that there are lions in the tall grass. It's okay for me to be afraid, particularly right now. I am, after all, doing a lot of things I've never done before. All of us are. Fear and forward movement. While it may seem to be placing too low a bar to say that indulging in a scary movie is a courageous act, I would only agree if the experience in my life existed in a vacuum. They do not. My fear is generally the boss, but it has many sidekicks and thugs. Anger, anxiety, and the want to quell them and deal with them in unhealthy ways are all part of the same chain. I suffer to the degree that I attempt to control these symptoms of my fear. Any act in which I relinquish this control and simply bask in the fact that life is hard and I will be afraid is an act of courage. I have long ago made peace with my love for scary movies. They are, to me, akin to the want for people to ride roller coasters. I now allow myself to be greatly terrified at any opportunity that I can find. I know that others do not indulge in the same intentional discomfort, and that is no less valid a form of confrontation. In a world where lots of people readily sacrifice their own comfort to cater to the pleasure and comfort of others, having a personal boundary like that is also an act of courage. This is all where the bread meets the butter.
I'm asking everybody if, do you like bread and butter?
You know what? I'm on a low carb diet at the moment, but I love it. So I'm not allowing myself bread. I like butter on carb balanced tortillas.
The more and more I look at my relationships to the fiction in my life that I am truly passionate about, the more I see connections to everything. Some are flimsy, dental floss-sized strings. Others are strong and fibrous ropes. These interactions with story and art bind me to ideals, or at the very least, plant the seeds for them. The young boy who is experiencing true fear in the face of a vampiric depiction on a flickering sepia screen turns into the man who knows what that feeling is and how to move through it in all aspects of his life. As he does that, he opens the door for more and more enjoyment. We are currently living in a level of fear, anxiety, and uncertainty that has not been witnessed in generations. It's fair to say that the experiences that I have been engaging in, something as efficient and visceral as silent horror movies, is a preparation for what we are seeing in the world right now.
Thinking of those moments where, like you're saying, watching a movie where, like, okay, nothing is going to be the same after this. Well, nothing is going to be the same after the past few weeks, you know. I'm when I say I enjoy my life and I'm grateful, it's true. I'm equal parts disgusted with a lot of the world right now, but if I could just wrap this around to what we were talking about earlier, I think that's why horror movies are a healthy thing, and why I do want to show my kids so that they kind of experience like this sort of this is going to sound gruesome, but sort of like a bloodletting of fear, because I think it's like, Wes Craven once famously said, I've heard many people quote this, where it's like, horror films don't create fear, they release it. And I think that's exactly their job. You know what I mean? So, and I think that's a healthy part of growing up. And there's a reason why they're all marketed to kids, because that's what, think about it. It's like all the movies that you snuck into when you were little, you wanted to go see these R-rated horror movies. And those were the ones that all your friends were sneaking into, and you weren't allowed to tell your parents that you said I was going to such and such a movie, and it said I watched American Werewolf in London and stuff like that, because they have a very specific job for kids who are at that emotional level where they've got to learn how to negotiate these horrible things in the world.
A trial by fire of what's to come. An acknowledgement through fiction that the world can be a tough place, but that with the love like that of a parent and the guidance therein, you will be able to thrive amid the light and the shadows. Thank you for joining me.